So we said before this week, though, if you can believe it, since Brexit, only 7 other bills, not to do with Brexit, I think it's 6 or 7 bills, have actually been passed, and that's not including any of the Brexit bills or anything like that. So because the government is so quagmired in trying to sort out this mess, it can't deal with anything else. And this is why we need to just dump Brexit altogether, because this isn't going to improve. Brexit isn't going to improve the people in the country who are living in poverty, who are having to deal with austerity, who it's not going to help them. And you need to look at that fact objectively. And if you voted for Brexit thinking that it will somehow make your life better, I'm sorry, but you were lied to. And we had last week, one of the people from the UN come forward and say that austerity had been an ideologically driven project that has driven people to, suicide, and has caused deaths of hundreds of people. And yet the ministers in charge of this fire back at him with absolute ridiculousness. So we're going to read through what his response was to them about this, because this is the real issue in this country. This is what we should be really fighting against. And it shocks me, it really does shock me, that if Brexiteers put this much attention into trying to combat poverty in the UK and actually trying to make people's lives better, this country would be in a damn better state than it is now. So this comes from The Guardian. So UN poverty expert hits back over UK minister's denial of facts. So Philip Alston says he thought the government response to his report might be a spoof. So the guy who wrote the report literally couldn't believe what the government was responding to them, to a point where he thought a satirical account or a spoof had been reported. You know it's going to get bad from here. So the United Nations expert whose warning of deepening poverty in Britain was this week dismissed as barely believable by ministers, and has said that the government's denial is worrying as the poverty itself. Philip Alston, the UN rapporteur on his extreme poverty and human rights, published his final report on the state of Britain on Wednesday. In it, he accused the government of a systematic immunisation of a significant part of the British population. Ministers reported that it was a completely inaccurate picture of our approach to tackling poverty, and instead claimed that the UK was among the happiest countries in the world. Alston, an eminent New York-based human rights lawyer, said that the government response amounted to a total denial of a set of uncontested facts, and that when he first read its public comments, I thought it might actually be a spoof. He said he feared it showed that the ministers were not willing to debate official figures that showed that 14 million people were living in relative poverty, and therefore considered what he believes are essential changes to the welfare system. The statement is as troubling as the situation, he said. There is nothing that indicates any willingness to debate over the issues which have generated endless, very detailed, but totally reputable reports across the political spectrum in the UK. All of these have been dismissed. Alston's report compares the Conservative politics to the creation of a Victorian workhouses. Amber Rudd and the And Amber Rudd, and the Work and Pension Secretary, said she felt it was politically biased and alleged that Alston did not do enough research, only visiting the UK for 11 days. The government said that it would complain to the United Nations, and the UK's ambassador in Geneva is understood to this week to request a meeting with the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights over the matter. One Alston said the Department for Work and Pension had created a digital and sanitised version of the 19th century workhouse. Some commentators said he had gone too far. The historian Dominic Sandbrook wrote in the Daily Mail that it was simply ridiculous and an insult to our national intelligence. But far from backing down, Alston, who described his politics as progressive and left of centre, has pushed his argument harder. I think beating rocks has some similarity to the 35 hours of job search required per week to receive universal credit for people who have been out of work for months or years, he said. They have to go through the motions, but it is completely useless. That seems to me to be very similar to the approach in the old style workhouse. The underlying mentality is that we are going to make the place sufficiently unpleasant that you really won't want to be here. In response to this, the government cited research showing that the UK was one of the happiest places in the world to live. It appeared to be a study that placed the UK 15th behind 12 other European countries, including Germany, Ireland, the Netherlands, and the whole of Scandinavia. That takes the denial on the part of the government to new heights, Alston said. The government is proceeding as if the problems that I've reported don't exist. It is a case that 14 million people do not live in poverty. Do they contest the child poverty predictions? That is what it seems to be. Alston may have overstated one of the most startling statistics in the report, that close to 40% of children are expected to live in poverty by 2021. It was based on a forecast rise from 30% from 2016 to 37% made in 2021. Made 18 months ago by the Institute of Financial Studies, which now says that it is likely to be an overestimate. The latest official figures, published in March, reveal that the proportion of children in relative poverty has remained flat at 30% to 2018, which is still an absolute crime, by the way, and should be appalling. And the Tories deserve an absolute kicking for this, because they're the ones responsible for this. So Alston said that his figures were still bad. We go down from 40% to 1/3 of British children. Is that a good result? I've already said that. It's not a good result. Alston, a law professor at New York University, has been the UN poverty reporter since 2014 and has carried out investigations in countries including the US, Uganda, Saudi Arabia, China, Chile, and he said that governments normally respond with a detailed analysis of or refutation of his reports, but that had not come from the UK. Lanos, which is investigated earlier this year, has already failed to disclose the 20-page response. In his reports, he deliberately avoids the arid and evasive language of diplomacy, and that often leads him into political conflict. He said it was a disgrace that the UN did not fully accept responsibility for the cholera outbreak its workers imported to Haiti after the 2010 earthquake. And in 2018, he accused the Trump administration of being driven by contempt and sometimes even by hatred for the poor, while bringing in massive tax breaks for corporations and the very wealthy. Trump's ambassador to the UN at the time, Nikki Haley, accused him of being biased and being misleadingly and politically motivated. Alston is 69 and married, a father of 4, and he studied law at Melbourne University and moved to Berkeley in California for his doctorate in the late 1970s. He has long been associated with the UN and is included as an official in Geneva for 6 years and chairing its Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights for 8 years. A UN Special Reporter on the Extrajudicial Summary of Arbitrary Executions for another 6 years. He has travelled to countries including Sri Lanka, Nigeria, Afghanistan and Ecuador. He is well regarded by colleagues who in January sprung a surprise on him at an academic conference. He arrived for what he was expected to be a routine event, only to find a 2-day seminar dedicated to his human rights work instead of party games and music and scholars who had been planning the event in secret for 2 years. Give papers and panels discussions at what they dubbed Philfest. So this is a guy who is highly regarded by his fellow peers, to a point where they, as was just said there, a 2-day event celebrating his work and his papers that he has written. So this report is absolutely damning, but it is another example, as I said at the beginning of this video, of our government being completely crippled, the Tory government unable to be willing to do that because they are more interested in their rich donors. And now you have, if Brexit happened, this is only going to get worse, because the hardcore Tories, the hard right Tories who are pushing for Brexit, want to take away tons of regulations that protect the poorest in our society. You've got Nigel Farage, who wants to privatise the NHS, and I highly suspect under a no-deal Brexit, parts of our NHS will be sold off to private US insurance companies, which will put an even more ungodly burden on the NHS. Thus adding an even more financial element if we did go to a private-based insurance, that people could not afford medical treatment. And that's a potential scenario, a likely scenario as well, which is all the more worrying. And as I said, if Brexiteers actually campaigned as hard as they have for Brexit over this, we might not be in this situation. But then again, you'll never see Dankula, Sargon, or any of these other YouTube political commentators really talk about the facts and what's going on in this country. And not one of them has ever done a video on this report, the state of austerity, and what it is doing to people's lives in this country. That's the real crime. And that's the rub as to why these guys are considered to be popular, when all they do is talk a big game, but when it comes to it, they have no answers, they have no plans. It's just, to end of the day, it's just money in their back pocket, and they don't care about these issues.